record this.
All right.
Hey, Greg, very nice to meet you. It's even though we've been in contact a lot this year somehow, right?
Yeah.
But last time I saw you was over 2 years ago.
That's correct. Yeah, at the whirlwind visit you gave to the to the tapping course because of the visa issues.
Yes. So Greg, like, even though I first met you in like 98 or so, I think it's been a really long time. I do not know so much about your background as a mathematician, which I'm really interested in, even though like I guess there's pretty much a limited knowledge on my end. but like one idea for this series of conversations is to just, I wouldn't just go by my intuition to find out about the people that I'm interested in terms of like, what is it, what you do, and what led you to where you are. Having heard from you that you even invented a new kind of mathematics or calculus or something like that. And so can you just tell us a little bit about Greg, the mathematician?
Sure. Absolutely. One of the things that I've been interested in my entire life is collective intelligence and cooperation, and that includes the things like concurrency, like doing multiple things all at once. Yes. Right. And as a musician, we know we have to do that, right? Whether you're coordinating your fingers while you're playing the guitar, or you're coordinating your fingers while you're a drummer, it's even more that way. But also, I have spent my fair share of hours as a short order cook. And you really have to be on top of a lot of threads all at once, right? You got to know that, the burgers take so much time, and the fries take so much time. And if you're going to get it all out so it's all hot, then you have to be aware of that. And so there's been a part of my mind that's always watching all these different kinds of engagements to say, what does this tell me about concurrency and coordination? And if you think about, what is it, Noah Yuval Harari, his book, Sapiens, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, he describes Homo sapiens' superpower is coordination. So, a given Cro-Magnon person is no match for a mastodon. But in coordination, they drove them to extinction, right? So this is something that is very much a part of who we are at a genetic level.
When you say you've been interested in this all your life, what exactly does that mean? When did you become aware of this?
So my mathematical experience began before I was verbal.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So I remember, contemplating the meaning and the experience of dimension before I could talk.
Wow. Is coordination, is that coordination of dimensions? Would that be your definition, or?
No, dimension is correlated to coordination. We need to invent some kind of space in which we're coordinating.
Mm-hmm, I see. Okay.
Right? But they're not the same. Mm-hmm. Right. So anyway, at a certain point, I became very interested in making some of my intuitions about coordination very precise. And this had a lot to do with knowing that we weren't going to be able to build systems that we need to build in order to get ourselves out of the jam that we're in, that we created for ourselves. Unless we had a very precise understanding of what it means to coordinate, at least in the in terms of computer programs coordinating. So I work with some of the top researchers in language design for concurrent computation. I worked directly with Christine Tomlinson and Mark Scavel and Greg Lavender, a bunch of folks, on the design and implementation of an actor-based language called Rosette. And this was back in the late 80s and early 90s. And we built a lot of really large scale systems, such as a data cleaning application for Bellcore, which was the family of telecommunications companies, and data cleaning and integration applications for Eastman Chemical / Kodak. And I realized that when we were doing these systems, even though our abstractions could help them build their applications, which were large-scale coordination applications, in an order of magnitude less time, it was also required a level of intellectual engagement, which is very difficult for most humans. And the sociological literature and psychological literature bears this out. So even people who know what they're doing and have solved the problems before make incredibly stupid mistakes in when reasoning about these kinds of systems. And so I wanted to provide some mathematical abstractions which would allow us to solve some of the complexity of that. And so I thought about it. I was exposed to a talk by a mathematician, computer scientist, who's now a member of a fellow of the Royal Society, Samson Abramsky, and he gave a talk about linear logic, which was a brand new logic discovered in the late 80s that is resource sensitive. So it's already beginning to be about coordination. I know I'm saying a lot of stuff. I'll get to the point very quickly.
Yeah. And I hope you don't mind me asking questions also.
Oh, no, of course. Interrupt anytime. But so like just a quick digression through logic, and it'll pay off later. So it's really weird how we have our path through our understanding of what logic is. So if you think about Aristotelian logic, right, the kinds of machines that they were exposed to were things like catapults, right? Slingshots, bows and arrows, those kinds of things. You know, it's like you only have so many arrows in your quiver, right? So you fire off your arrows, right? And then you're out of arrows unless you can go either make some or go recover the ones you shot, you're out of arrows. So that society, the kind of mechanism that they were faced with was clearly bounded by resource, and yet the logic that they come up with, right? Aristotle, 3,000 years ago, the logic that they come up with is the logic of the digital era. The logic that they come up with is one that hides inside itself the ability to copy without cost, right? Which is exactly what we have in the internet today, and why we have all kinds of issues with the dissemination of information, because you can spread a cat meme all over the internet at zero cost, or at least apparently zero cost, because it costs nothing to make a copy. And so it wasn't until the late 80s that we get a notion of logic that is sensitive to resource. And so Samson Abramsky, who later becomes my PhD advisor, he gives a talk about linear logic and its relationship to reasoning about concurrency. And I was very impressed by this talk. This was at a conference where I was also presenting. I was very impressed by his talk. And I went away and read his paper, Computational Interpretations of Linear Logic. And I said, I'm never going to do computer science that isn't like that again. his paper is beautiful. He starts with what most of us think as sort of logic and its relationship to computation, and then he says, okay, well, we're going to change the game a little bit so that the logic is more resource conscious. So he goes from intuitionistic logic to intuitionistic linear logic, and he recovers the notion of computation associated with that. And then he goes from intuitionistic linear logic to classical linear logic, which is again another kind of relaxation. The system becomes more symmetric, and he recovers the notion of computation that goes with that. And so at each step, he's building an abstract machine, which is perfectly correct with respect to the logic. And I was like, okay, I'm never, ever going to build software or do computer science that doesn't have this level of correctness. So I think about it some more, and I realize that there's this beautiful mathematical phenomena called Curry-Howard. And that mathematical phenomena says that logic is to types, as in types in a programming language, as proofs are to programs, right? And so there's this correspondence, and that correspondence turns out to be very deep. And if you investigate it, it runs throughout even classical mathematics. And I know this is a long story. Almost done. I promise. Almost done.
I have so many questions already.
Almost done. So I think about it and I realize this probably also works for concurrency, because at the time it was only working for a sequential notion of computation and a very specific kind of logic. And I said, this should work out in the concurrency setting. And so I pitched this idea to Abramsky. I said, Curry-Howard should extend to the concurrency setting. And I want to work this out, because if we don't have a logic for concurrency that is sort of algorithmically connected to our notions of concurrent computation, then concurrent programming will be too hard for people to build at scale. And I wrote at this time, I had a corner office at MCC with all the compute toys I could possibly ask for. And I wrote to him and I said, I made the pitch, and he said, amazing, this is exactly what we're working on. We just started working on this. And so I left my corner office in Austin, Texas for a little graduate student hovel at Imperial College, and began working on that particular puzzle. And I'll leave it there, but there's several other steps before I can kind of complete the picture. But I've been yammering on for long enough. Please ask some questions.
Well, so first of all, linear logic. Why is it like, as I imagine, so linear meaning it's linear, right?
It's linear in the sense of linear algebra, not linear in the sense of sequential.
Okay,
it's
okay.
In the sense that there's a kind of accounting, so one in, one out, that kind of linear. You're like if you have second order phenomena, right, you have x squared, what a linear equation looks like, right? Yeah. So right, a line, and really what that's saying is that there's a kind of relationship between the inputs x and the outputs y, where there's no copying or other kinds of dynamics going on, and that's what linear logic characterizes.
Yeah. So, and concurrency, coordination, how is that represented? I mean, like, obviously, like, coordinates is what I imagine. Like, yeah. I don't know how is concurrency represented in your system?
Yeah. So when I got to Imperial, Samson says you should study this calculus called the pi calculus. Mm-hmm. So I dutifully figure out the pi calculus, and so I can. And by the way, for your listeners and for yourself, Robin Milner, who invented the pi calculus, he won the Turing Award for this. So this is this is some
Okay.
deep stuff, right? But
Mhm.
it's deep in the same way that Go is deep, right? Very small number of rules, and millennia to play it and enjoy all of its subtleties.
Mhm.
I look at the pi calculus, and the pi calculus is based on a really radical idea that all computation happens by interaction. So everything, including numbers, including strings, is represented as patterns of interaction.
And what is the definition of interaction?
So one metaphor that can help to understand this is passing messages. So as musicians, we understand what it means to pass a message, right? I send you some musical information, and you receive it, and you go, oh, okay, well, here's some musical information back at you. And as musicians, we know that harmony comes out of being able to do that simultaneously.
Yeah.
So this is very much the metaphor that's going on in the pi calculus. So the pi calculus has two basic. So it says all computation happens in terms of processes that are communicating using channels. So you have a process that's waiting on a channel for some information, and then on receipt of that, will go on to become another process that has the information available to it. And then you have another process in the asynchronous form of this calculus. You have another process that's just sending information. So it's kind of fire and forget. And then beyond that, you have the parallel composition of processes. So putting your bandmates together, and it's like, when bands are really working, right? All the musicians working together become one musician. So pi calculus says all these processes put in parallel composition is also a process. So that's another construct. Of course, you have silence, or the process that does nothing. And then the pi calculus has another construct, which is creating a fresh channel. So making a channel that nobody's ever seen before. And that's basically all the primitives there are in the pi calculus. There's some form of recursion or replication. So being able to fork off a copy of a process, an exact copy of, or a duplicate form of the process, which is a kind of recursion. And that's it. That's all you need. And that is Turing complete. That is provably Turing complete. Another way to come at this is what I call the 4 C's. So if you're thinking about computation, first of all, there are lots and lots of models of computation. There's the lambda calculus and the Turing machines and Petri nets and blah, 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 right? And there's a big question in the community, which is, why would you use one model versus another? How do you compare and contrast them? So back in the mid to late 80s, I came up with a framework for analyzing this. I said, all right, there are 4 C's. 1, is it complete? Can I say everything I'd want to say within the model? 2, is it compositional? In other words, can I make programs more complex or richer programs out of smaller, simpler ones? Right? So that's just good engineering. And we do this when we're making musical compositions, right? We have little nuggets that we string together. And then completeness, compositionality, concurrency. Does it have an explicit representation of concurrency? So like in musical notation, we have an explicit representation of concurrency, right? Multiple staves is an explicit representation of concurrency. And then finally, does it have an accounting of resources? So can you count space and time? In the late 80s, I wrote down these properties. I analyzed the existing models of computation. I could make retrodictions about the research using these properties. So for example, lambda calculus has no good accounting of resources. And so you can predict there will be very, very few papers about the lambda calculus exploring complexity theory. It's because it doesn't have any account of resources. It doesn't give you what complexity is. Whereas Turing machines are not compositional, even though they have a good accounting of resources. So you won't use Turing machines to reason about refactoring programs, whereas you will use lambda calculus for that. So I could make all these predictions. So the model, this analysis of computation made a lot of sense. When I analyzed all the models to date, I saw that nobody checked all the boxes. Not a single one of them checked all the boxes. And so I predicted that another one would come along. And lo and behold, the pi calculus came along and it checked all the boxes. And Samson was asking me to go and look at that one. So I just told you roughly what the pi calculus does. Now, Robin,
so let me, because like of the four C's that you mentioned, like the the concurrency seems to be the biggest problem, like that, as far as I can tell, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That was exactly it. But it turns out you need all of them working in a certain balanced way before you get a holistic perspective. And I just want to say that this is deep stuff from the point of view of human psychology and human cognition, right? Like there's a blind spot in humanity's conception of itself in the world when it comes to autonomy and concurrency. Human societies tend to have some kind of weird fetish for top-down organization, even though they can't carry it out, right? They fail miserably. And that's because there seems to be some weirdness in our psychology. So if you think about it, the first model of computation that has this property that we know about in history is the pi calculus. That's in the early 90s. So thousands of years of human cognition, and we millennia even, like more than millennia, and we don't have a good way to think about this or reason about this in a way that is allows us to make predictions until the pi calculus comes along. And if you think about how much this has stymied our scientific development, general relativity is not compositional. And until very recently, the presentations of quantum mechanics were not compositional. And that's why they don't talk to each other. They can't, we're unable to think about the very small and the very large in the same unified theory of physics because our thinking isn't compositional. So the smartest people ever, like Schrodinger, Einstein, lots of people like that, there's a big hole in their thinking. Yeah. And so you put your finger on it when you said, hey, this concurrency stuff seems to be really hard.
So that means that the pi calculus has sort of like revolutionized scientific or mathematical thinking, or right?
It's in the process of doing so. It takes a long time for these things to disseminate.
Yeah. So that means people are adapting the ideas, or let's say the solutions of pi calculus, in order to come up with more complete systems, ways of thinking.
But remember, human knowledge is very siloed.
Yeah.
Right. So like mavericks like Bob Kuka and Samson Abramsky and myself, we're talking about this openly. But it's going to take another 30, 40 years before the physics community en masse, or in the mainstream physics community, is going to understand how these techniques work. So that now finally I can tell you about my work. So I've set up the I've set up the stage. So I looked at Robin's work in detail, and I looked at ways to provide categorical models of the pi calculus and a bunch of other things. And Samson and I worked on some approaches to categorical models, but I didn't like the directions that Samson was taking. I felt that the math we were doing was not going to result in software that ordinary software developers could handle. And so the whole challenge was to come up with what was called a name-free or channel-free account of the pi calculus. Can we make a version of the pi calculus where because what the pi calculus does is it says, if you hand me a theory of names or channels, then I'll give you a theory of processes that use those channels to communicate. That's kind of how it's presented. But the problem is that the theory of the theory of processes makes some requirements on the theory of names that ultimately makes the theory of names ultimately as powerful as any other computational model. So there's a bug in Robin's proposal. So Robin says, if I use an SAT style analogy, so lambda is to sequential computation as what is to concurrent computation, and he's proposing the pi calculus, it doesn't solve the problem because he needs to import something that is equally powerful as a model of computation in order to build his model of computation. So there's a little loop that he's in his math. And I said, hey, why don't we just embrace that loop? And so the row calculus is a variant of the pi calculus that's much smaller and simpler and much more expressive. And the little mind twist is to say that channels are the codes of processes. So you have a running process, then you can take the code or the address of that process, and that gives you a channel. And then given a channel, you can always go back to the running process that it represents. And that's also Turing complete. So it's much smaller, but it gives you higher order phenomena and reflective phenomena. So I can, in the same way today, program ship JavaScript around the internet. I can ship processes around in the row calculus.
So let me ask you here. So just as you can imagine, it's difficult for me to follow.
I understand.
But if you say that the code itself is the channel, right?
Yeah.
How is the code being used as a channel? So basically, it means, like, if I just think of like my programming skill from like 35 years ago doing Turbo Pascal or something, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So there's like, so it's like a function. Is it like a function? Like the channel is like a function? Is that the way to think about it? But obviously, because it's code, it can be a very big function, let's say. But is there such a thing as an input and an output? And is that what you mean by a channel, or what is it?
Not. So think about it more like, you know how a URL gets you to a resource. So think about a URL as like a channel, or a phone number is like a channel. Now, what Robin wanted to avoid, what he was scared
of. It's not an address, right? That's kind of like how I would see it in my worldview.
It's like an address. It's like a blockchain address, right? So if you think about a blockchain address, someone can go and deposit some Bitcoin in an address, and someone else can come along and take that Bitcoin out. And that corresponds exactly to sending some information and receiving some information. Okay, so very much like an address. But Robin's channels don't have any interior structure. You can't see. It's like an atom, right? You can't see into it, right? But that doesn't work for a number of practical reasons. You need to know, like with a URL, there's slashes in it, and they can be as long as you want them to be. So instead of using slashes, why don't we just use the code, a computer program code, to be able to make addresses? The code is the address.
Yes.
Right. So we're just using it syntactically, and the syntax allows us to differentiate one address from another. So we're not asking the channels to behave yet. In the paper, I actually show how you can make that work too. But we're just saying that the address has got to have some rich syntax associated with it. The channel has to have some rich syntax. And where do we get that syntax from? Oh, just get it from the syntax of processes. That's it.
And again, I'm not a specialist or anything, but it reminds me a little bit of like the genetic code, right? It just is there.
Yes, that's exactly it. That was another. So there were multiple factors that went into the design of the row calculus, and one was to make a calculus that corresponded to the abstractions that we have come to utilize when reasoning about genotype and phenotype. So process is phenotype and channel is genotype.
Mhm.
And so now you can think about when you get the genes, right, you could instantiate them into another process, right? So,
Yes. Yeah.
right, so this is exactly, the other one was the yin yang symbol, right? So processes have inside them channels, which are in fact just, right? And that kind of thing. So all of these different kinds of balance went into the design of the row calculus.
Mm-hmm. So it's some kind of archetype of recursion or representation of recursion somehow, where the code basically can eventually start working on itself somehow.
Yes, that's exactly right. But
Yeah.
in a setting where nobody's in charge, where you have a notion of autonomy, and that autonomy corresponds to composition, right? So you can build societies, you can build you can build tissue out of cells, for example.
Yes.
Where each cell is a process, and then you put all the processes in parallel composition, and that gives you tissue, and you can climb up the ladders of complexity that way.
So you just used the word autonomy again, and you used it before, but I can't remember if you explained. You said that concurrency and autonomy are the two big problems or misunderstandings that human beings, or things that we can't do well. So can you give an example for autonomy, like why it's so difficult for humans?
Yes. So you could imagine that there's a discipline where the pharaoh tells all the slaves, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, right? And so they're all working, but they're all in this top-down structure. So there's a kind of concurrency happening, but that concurrency is wedded to a top-down structure. Whereas the reality of human society is not top-down at all. And in fact, like climate change is a really good example. Like we're trying to get, the Paris Accords are really an attempt at a top-down solution, right? So all the leaders of all the states get together and they hash it out, and then they try to impose those restrictions or modifications, policies on the populace. But if the populace isn't on board, it doesn't happen. Right? Because they're acting autonomously in some very real sense. And so this is what I mean, is the independent interaction that doesn't necessarily result in a roll up to a leader. So there's a big difference between having a conductor versus having a band that becomes one person.
This is great that you mentioned the conductor, because like the word that's kind of like in my head since you even mentioned concurrency was that it only, like, and this is, I'm really looking forward to your answer, like you need some sort of master clock, right? In a sense, to have some idea what concurrency actually is, or like the question is in a mathematical model, how would you represent that? Because you can't, I guess you can't do that with fractions because
there isn't a master clock.
Okay.
There isn't a master clock. And in fact, and that goes all the way back to general relativity. There is no master clock in general relativity, right? There are events that cannot be ordered, right? Because they're a space-like distance separated from each other. But what you do have is that when processes synchronize, meaning that one process is handing information to another process, at least for that interaction, they have a common experience of time.
That's the concurrency, is the experiencing of the same time at that point.
Yeah. At least we touched at this point, right?
Yeah.
And if we touch repeatedly, then we can build notions of local clocks.
Yeah.
And that's what it means to have stretchy time in music, right? We don't have to have a metronome, but we have to touch repeatedly. And as long as we're all touching in repeatedly in a organically sensible way, then the audience will join us in that sense of time.
You know, like for me always, but especially in the past year, like this thought and idea of like the strange attractor has come up quite a bit in experiencing like what I do, having gone through like the development to be the musician that I am right now. But just realizing that making music, like at least for me, always, I have to say, always kind of has this characteristic that things rearrange and start kind of like oscillating together, even if they were never intended to oscillate together somehow, and really just the intention of bringing people together in a band, for example, as you were saying, or playing notes into a looping system, or like a feedback system on a mixing desk, or like all of this seems to be kind of like always finding its state of resonance, and is something like that, just for me to understand what you mean when you talk about this local clock, let's say. Where does it come from? Does it come from, is it some sort of oscillation, or how? Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we can certainly understand what it means to repeatedly interact, right? So we can imagine that as we are in this conversation, we're kind of passing the token back and forth, right? So I say something, you say something, you say something, I say something, right? And so there's this repeated or iterated exchange of information, right? And so for some bounded scope, right? So for some fixed number of iterations, for example, that's a local a place where we've touched often enough that we can experience a time, and the extent to which that's regular, you can make it more and more precise.
Yeah, that's kind of, I guess, where my question really is, like, is there some sort of pattern, let's say pattern recognition involved, that kind of like at which, well, I guess it's kind of like the notion of randomness versus pattern, right? Is like, would like a, well, I guess you know what I'm trying to say. It's difficult for me to put it into words, but
no, I do very much understand what you're trying to say. So if we think about a really brain dead computation, right? So a brain dead computation would be process A sends a token to process B, and once process B has received the token, it gives it back to A. And we can write down a simple recursive expression that will give that pattern. So, and that's now a metronome, right? Mm-hmm. And because it's so regular and stupid, the only stretchiness would be if someone could get in the middle of that, right? So you could, like, if the speed of exchange was, even if the speed of exchange was stretchy, the two processes wouldn't know it, right? Like like sometimes the exchange takes a millennia and sometimes it takes a heartbeat, and right, but they wouldn't know that. All they know is I give the token to you, you give the token back to me, unless they can compare it to other exchanges, right? And that's right. At least for many physicists, this is really what time is lots and lots of different interactions that can all be correlated.
I think I just had a huge insight.
Well, please share.
So I guess like one of the mistakes I'm making when thinking about computation is that I'm generalizing it too much, in the sense of that I'm always also thinking that a human being, or because you use the example of human, like us talking to each other.
Yeah.
But I would say that I could totally see how in a system that is the kind of computer that we know nowadays, that you could make these assumptions that you're making, and that this is absolutely kind of obvious, even for me, let's say, right?
Yeah.
But if we had, like, say, that biological computer involved in a process, I wonder if the rules would be completely different.
Well, the idea is to build sets of rules so that you can get to that level of complexity, and you can peel back the layers of complexity and get back down to simple clocks, right?
Yes.
So you can build more and more richer kinds of clocks out of smaller, simpler ones.
Yeah. So this is like, maybe in the mid 80s, I read some Douglas Hofstadter books, and like the simplest example that he gives for, like, I think he's using the flushing mechanism in the toilet, where you have the floater, right?
Yeah.
As sort of like the most basic idea of a process that has some sort of analytical tool inserted into the circuit, which in this case is just the floater, right?
Yeah.
So what you just said about the complexity, I guess, like, all you would really need, like, if what Hofstadter said kind of is right anyway, but for me it seemed like to make sense, is that you only need the recursion, and you need to kind of like insert that code, let's just call it code. So you kind of like, put the code into some sort of feedback loop, and that would give you, and I mean, that would give you the complexity. That's what I experience when I use feedback loops, even in the digital laptop.
Absolutely. And in the row calculus, inserting that code is just putting it in parallel composition with the code for the water flow and the flusher, right? All of those things just naturally fit side by side. And now there doesn't have to be anyone in charge. There doesn't have to be, and this corresponds to what we see in nature, right? There is no king slime mold cell that's telling all the slime molds, okay, now it's time to aggregate, right? And there's no king firefly that's telling all the fireflies, okay, now it's time to synchronize, right? It happens organically through protocol. And that's and so the idea is, can we build computational representations of these kind of phenomena, because that's how nature scales.
Was the pi calculus able to give us that kind of structure? No, right? Because
it does. It does, but the problem is that the pi calculus has a hole in it. The pi calculus is like, if you give me a theory of names, I'll give you a theory of processes that coordinate over those names.
Okay, I see.
Right, and so what I was trying to, another inspiration for the design of the row calculus was I was thinking about string theory, but from the perspective of a computer scientist and not a physicist, and it occurred to me that I could make computers of arbitrary complexity out of the vibrational modes of strings. So if I accept the hypothesis of universe as computer, then I'm building the computer out of a bunch of computers. Did I make any progress? And so then I asked myself, well, as I said before with the hole in the pi calculus, I said, well, can I just embrace that loop and make something of the loop rather than to throw up my hands in despair? And that's where the row calculus came into being.
Sounds really wonderful. I mean, how popular has it gotten, if at all?
Well, it was published in peer-reviewed journals, and or conferences, and then there are groups like the University of Aalborg has a research group that's been looking at the row calculus for a few years, and Christian Williams, who is, I don't know if you know who John Baez is, but John Baez is one of this century's most smartest mathematical physicists, and so I've collaborated with a few of his students, so Christian Williams, as a part of his PhD work, came up with a formal model for the row calculus on the way to another one of my mathematical things, which is all about where logics come from, but we don't have to get into that. So there's that, and then RChain use the row calculus to as the basis of its architecture, and because of that, RChain is now the most scalable blockchain on the planet. So RChain scales linearly, whereas so for the last 50 years or so, we've been scaling software systems by adding hardware. Like, you can't just sit around and pray that someone's going to come up with a software innovation. Instead, you say, no, we're just going to throw hardware at the problem, because hardware is commodity, and it's like you can manufacture large scale systems even out of unreliable components. And I just read this wonderful book, Turing's Cathedral, by someone who had kind of a ringside seat. One of Freeman Dyson's kids wrote this book, and so he talks about the building of ENIAC and MANIAC, which were responsible for all the calculations involved in the hydrogen bombs. But anyway, it's like, even as early, like before there were, even desktop computers, there were these large scale computers, and it was the same philosophy. We scale by assembling lots of components, assuming that some percentage of them are going to fail, right? So that's how it works. But existing blockchains, they get slower as you add hardware, but RChain gets faster as you add hardware. So the numbers that we have currently are, we get about 1,000 transactions per second per node in the network per CPU. So if you have a network of 10 nodes, each node has 10 CPUs, that's 10,000 transactions per second. 20 node network, each node has 20 CPUs, that's 20,000 transactions per second, and so on up to about 1,000, and then you start to get diminishing returns. But at 1,000, you're talking about 1 million TPS, which is very, very fast.
And so that has been accomplished by applying the row calculus, or by building on the row calculus.
Yeah. So the key insight is that most transactions are isolated. So I'll give you two metaphors. Metaphor number one: imagine somebody buying an empanada from a street vendor in Santiago. And now imagine somebody else at the same time buying some grilled tofu from a street vendor in Shanghai. Almost certainly, those two parties don't share the same bank account. and as a result, those transactions don't touch the same resources. And as a result, they can go forward concurrently. Right. And in fact, that's how they work in today's infrastructure. Well, the global financial system scales because of all the concurrency and all the isolation. And so the row calculus takes that into account, and that's how it provides that scaling.
So basically, it takes into account the probability of.
It's not probability.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
We can actually detect, we can statically detect when two transactions touch the same resources. So when they do, we say we got to put one in front of the other.
Yeah.
And
And
when
that's where things get slowed down. Just for
that's
that.
correct, because
Yeah. They have
right?
to. Yeah.
They have to. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know. But that's so the row calculus allows us to do that analysis and make things run as fast as they can go, as opposed, like Ethereum says, we're going to serialize all of those transactions. No, never going to scale.
Well, that's fascinating. So because also for me, it was always difficult to imagine how parallel processing could work, right? So like you have just described, basically by the example with the two people buying stuff where they don't access the same account. So it's basically that question, right, that you have to ask yourself and answer for how to make things run in parallel.
You got it.
Right?
You got it. Exactly. And the model of message passing lines up with transactions, right? So we say, let's call the account number the channel.
Yeah.
Right. So if I can put funds into a channel and I can take funds out of the channel. Right.
Yeah.
And so now that you can see that the abstraction of the row calculus just fits perfectly with that kind of information flow, and not by accident, it's by design.
Mm-hmm. So how did you end up, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, again, it's obvious how from your scientific work you would arrive at our chain, right? But what happened? Like which people did you meet, or like how did it come about?
So that's great. So I mean, the larger scale perspective on this is, I see that we have a problem societally, and that we're going to need new coordination tools. At first, I'm just working with the pi calculus, and I use and you know, I tend to use the corporate infrastructure to serve my ends. So I made a proposal to Microsoft about a workflow kind of technology using the pi calculus, and that was BizTalk process orchestration. And that was a very successful project, by the way. I think in 2004, it won Product of the Year award. And along the way, I kind of got enough insights that I could begin to formulate the row calculus. And I wanted to push the biology side of this more, and Microsoft didn't want to go in that direction. So I said, well, I've got the tech. I've got the contacts. And so I went off and raised money for a biotech company. And you know, to cut out a bunch of, you know, meandering. At one point, I was approached by an entrepreneur who was very worried about the economic imbalance that we had, like, you know, very, very few haves, lots and lots of have-nots, coupled with a kind of panopticon style social media, where Facebook can see everything about you and we can see nothing about Facebook. And so he wanted to build a decentralized social media. So this is before there was blockchain, before there was anything. And I thought about what he was talking about, and I said, yes, we can do this. But I didn't see how to decentralize the payment system. And so around 2014, I looked at Bitcoin and I said, oh, this blockchain idea would be how we would decentralize the payments part of this. And then I looked very carefully at the proof of work architecture and the Bitcoin architecture and the Ethereum architecture, and I realized none of that would scale. So I said, okay, I'll build the blockchain. And then I'll build the decentralized social media. So that's kind of how Archain got started. Yeah.
What an adventure.
Oh, tell me about it. And all of this is in service of a very the reality is that we are so screwed because of the way we have lived on planet Earth. Just one simple example. We're so far off with respect to the Paris Accords that we're likely to blow past 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise in the next 30 years. What that means, though, is that we're likely to blow past 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise in a much shorter time frame. Possibly as little as 10 years, somewhere, but maybe 20 years, but somewhere in that time frame, right? Our kids will, maybe not yet have kids. We might not even be grandparents when we hit that temperature rise. Unfortunately, the tropical zone around the planet becomes uninhabitable past 1.5 degrees temperature rise. And then you look at the numbers, 40% of the world's population lives in that area. So we're talking 2.8 billion people become climate refugees in as little as 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's a humanitarian crisis like we've never seen in the history of the human race. And I view our ability to respond to those challenges as coordination problems. And I'm not the only one. Like in Bill Gates's recent 60 Minutes interview, he says that dealing with the consequences of climate change are going to be like will require global coordination that exceeds the coordination we saw in World War II. So that's the kind of global scale coordination we're going to need. And as I mentioned before, attempting to only use top-down models fails miserably. So I'm trying to build a public a global compute infrastructure so that we can self-organize and self-assemble to foster bottoms-up solutions. So that's really what this has been about for me for the last 30 years. Quite an adventure, though, right? I've had to reinvent the foundations of computing, and
yeah, but that makes sense, though, and I think like the grander psychological, let's say, makeup, some societies have, right? Like there's this, like for example, in Germany here, if you take the bus and you don't have a ticket, you may go to jail.
Wow.
Like there's like this crazy, it's like an old law that's from the Nazis still, right? It's still in place, and it's kind of, it shows, and like if somebody goes to jail, like the daily costs are, I don't know, $2,000 or something. So like, if somebody isn't paying, and you see, it's that kind of thinking, which also leads to capitalism, same kind of like idea, like the idea of the profit. I think it could be easy if we would say, it's okay if you also have money. It's okay if you can also survive. And it would put humanity in a completely different place where we would not have to exploit so much.
Yeah. I hear you.
And so, but I mean, like I'm just saying this from this perspective, like and amazing that you are kind of like thinking in terms of building a structure that allows a different kind of interaction and coordination, and I'd really like to see it come to fruition. Very soon.
So would I.
Yeah.
I mean, we're I'm very happy about where we are. We're demonstrating scale. We've got we've been in mainnet for 2 years. The testnet has these block merge features. So we're demonstrating. We just finished an NFT proof of concept. So it's all coming together. We're in the middle of another $30 million fundraise. So, and we're getting traction on that. So it's but at the end of the day, you know, you can build these tools and people won't use them potentially. This is why you know, the other side of what I do, the whole musical stuff, I believe is also important. Now, I know that what gets me out of bed is not just the math, but very much the music. And I can tell you that my day is completely transformed after I put in my practice time. The energy and the openness and the flow is, you know, is there after I put in my practice. And
Preaching to the choir.
yeah. But also I think you know, we talked about how compositionality is a blind spot in human cognition and societal cognition. Also, the power of musical coordination seems to be a blind spot. Like this weekend, I gave a talk at the Foresight Institute's Vision Weekend. And the Foresight Institute it's a STEM culture, you know, science, technology, engineering, math. So STEM culture is so refreshing to be in that culture as opposed to talking to tons of investors. But you know, the thing is that, like, some of the technical leadership at the Foresight Institute, they've written a draft of a book that's all about intelligent cooperation. There is not a single chapter about music, not one word about the power of but I believe that it provides fundamentally different models of coordination. I mean, we can't deny the power of music to organize human behavior, from symphonies at the city level to, you know, stadium level rock bands. You know, people are organized by music. That's unassailable, right? we can measure that in the billions of dollars in terms of human transactions. But and also, you know, just, you know, imagine your favorite movie. Now take away the soundtrack, right? I mean, you keep the dialogue, but no music. What does the experience become? So we know that music is coordinating, and, you know, harmony. There's no harmony if the trombone has to wait for the saxophone to finish its line, right? but in speech, we take turns.
Yeah, I think that sometimes I think that the main reason why I can talk with you, for example, about your field of work is not because you're a musician, but it's because I'm a musician. What I'm trying to say with that is that sort of like studying music has put me in a frame of mind that gives me the tools to understand other people's disciplines.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, and I think that is sort of like speaking of superpower, right? Like music is kind of a superpower.
Oh, totally. I agree 100%. Yes. 100%. Absolutely. Yeah. So this is why, you know, I feel like, you know, we can provide all the bits and bytes and all the technical tools, but another way I sometimes like to say it is, you know, you can discipline the body. Right? You know, we all know what it's like to, you know, submit oneself to an exercise regime or a diet or whatever. And you can also discipline the mind, right? We know what it's like to go through an academic course but the heart doesn't work that way. The heart works via more about receptivity as much as it is about activity. And I feel like music is the coordination models that really work when it comes to music have something to do with the heart. So.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, as an educator, that is like, it's the biggest lesson I've learned, is that there is no such thing as like a as you say, as a purely mental or physical discipline. There is that, as you call it, heart, like there is that, whatever, that power that is ineffable, right? That
Yes. Yes.
and that is really, that's what we need to learn to access as human beings, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, for example, like with some people I work with, for just a stupid example, there are people who don't do their homework, right? But they do come for every single lesson. They are always there. And so there's this, like, I think you don't really, there's not that one way, to practice your discipline.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
like, not it's a multidimensional thing. Like, there's, if what you need to learn is to come to these meetings, then that is the lesson.
Yeah.
And not the fact that you're trying to play C major arpeggio, right, or something. Right?
Yeah,
But you see what I mean. So it's
yeah.
really wonderful, because music kind of like allows for all of these psychological, physical, and emotional like processes to sort of like rearrange themselves. And as you say, there's no such thing as like a top-down thing. Everything is kind of in flux, and is do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I'm right. And that's why I feel like, because I walk around with the question, like, what am I doing with my time when I'm playing music?
mm-hmm.
Right. I know I need to, because my
Mm-hmm.
life degrades, but in terms of our clear and present dangers, what's the role of my musical activity in terms of that? And these are just some guesses that I'm making with respect to that. One is, I think we can't ignore how music coordinates people at scale. It's like there was a soundtrack to the 60s, right? There was the 60s was a real shift in societal organization. And there was a soundtrack to it. And I think that we need to contemplate how we might consciously and deliberately develop a soundtrack to this transition period in human society, where we're not going to be able to live the way we have lived in the past. And
I think that it goes further, like the example you've just given us, that like somehow like it goes from the individual to the society, but it also goes from the individual to the in society, to the parts of you, to your internal communication. And by making music, by practicing music, even if you're on your own, like you don't have to play in a band necessarily, you kind of practice that communication. And that is sort of like the power we have over the world somehow. Like, how do I talk with myself? How do I communicate with myself? And in turn, how do I communicate with other people?
Mhm.
And so that's why this what happens nowadays with not just with social media, but already with TV, is right, that there is like this disconnect between like what you think is important, right? Like, knowing what's happening in the world, but what does it really matter for being here and being making a good contribution, in that moment and in the environment you're in. And that's that kind of disconnect. I think music, that's why I think I feel so good when I actually practice or play music in a day, because it sort of like reconnects me with the here and now.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. And it's really interesting. I can, in many ways, my musical practice reminds me of what happens in my meditation practices, where it's like if even in a simple meditation practice where I'm just attending to my breath, I can see the transition points. It's like I'm climbing this spiral staircase. But I forget, every time I go to that, put my ass on the pillow and it's like I've forgotten. Oh yeah, this is how this works. I have that remembering only after I've done a few turns around the spiral. And it's the same with the music. It's like my inner experience of the coherence of my practice shifts after a certain level of engagement, which then turns me around the spiral, so I can engage in a better way, which will create another shift. Does that make any sense? I don't feel like I'm being very articulate.
It all makes sense always.
Yeah.
With the row calculus, I would just say that you have sort of found a very fundamental, just for lack of a better word, like principle that helps you understand in inverted commas most of what we can see, what we can experience. What I mean by that is that, like, we can come up with a model for consciousness within that idea, right? And you can, as you say, you can apply to biology, mathematics, computer science, probably psychology, whatever. Like it's kind of like universal. So what I'm interested in, you as somebody who has you dove that deep, like you take that dive every day, right? Like, and as you said at the very beginning, I like that very much. You have to be very careful not to make wrong assumptions, even though you work with this material every single day. Like, you still need to be very careful. What kind of influence has this knowledge had on your life as a human being in this world where there's all sorts of different kinds of beings, let's say?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So like in some sense, I feel like it's like I have a cheat sheet, because it allows me to have a certain helicopter perspective on a lot of phenomena. It fundamentally changed my experience of the world I'm living in the sense that I began to suspect that there was a lot more life than I had previously thought. So in some sense, I was heavily influenced by the Western scientific viewpoint. And I thought that life was kind of off in this little compartment and most of the rest of the universe was sort of inanimate or dead, or didn't have life characteristics. But once I understood the row calculus, and by the way, what I've described is really just a tiny portion of a much larger mathematical theory that extends in lots of different directions. But I began to realize that I could contemplate different kinds of physics because I had this under my belt. And so as a simple example, who knows if this is true, but at least I could begin to think this way. In modern physics, we think of electrons, for example, as fungible. So the universe doesn't change if I take two electrons and I swap them, right? It's just like, the balance, if I have two cash registers at the store and I take $1 out of one and $1 out of the other, and I put them in the opposite registers, the balance in the store intake doesn't change at all. So but I began to realize that maybe that's only because we're separated from those entities by the scale of observation. What if there actually is a principle of natural selection going on that because our observations of these things is creating generations of selective pressure on them, that they're actually going through like eons of evolution by the time we've gotten to our next observation. And so they're relatively stable in the same way that the species of dog is relatively stable, right? Because we put certain selective pressures on that species, right? But if you were to look at it from the perspective of the origins of the universe, that species is not stable at all, right? At some point the sun's going to expand and eat up the earth, and and there won't be any dogs unless they get to outer space. So it's not very stable at that level of scope and scale. And the more I began to realize that there's enough structure at all scales of the universe to support intelligence, affect, evolution, all the things that make us special. I could find at every level of proposed structure of the universe. And so I began to realize, actually, I'm probably living in like the fabric of space-time itself is probably alive. And like once I had that guess, that hypothesis, it was like I stepped into a different world. It's like I crossed the threshold. I don't know how to say it. It was like, wow, it's so much more alive than I thought it was.
And again, to me, it makes total sense what you're saying. It makes total sense. Like for me, the interesting thing is that kind of experience of being alive, I first had it when I was able to live a feedback loop in my mind. Like when I was able to install something that was self-generating. And that was the first time in my life where I felt alive. It was kind of like, I've just said that in some other conversation actually, where I realized I was able to actually ask the question, and I was able to ask the question in such a way that it became a feedback loop. And that was the moment where I had that sort of experience of being alive, and as you say, experiencing everything as being alive.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that there's like if you look at again the Western scientific viewpoint on life doesn't really it doesn't have a good explanation about the nature and origin of life. And especially the idea of trying to get life to come out of non-living things is hard. but what if life was built in from the beginning? So at least it's an alternative. I'm not saying that it's necessarily right, and there maybe there is a kind of non-equilibrium thermodynamics view of life, but
in a way you could say, how could it not be? Right?
Yeah.
That's gonna, yeah.
Exactly. So those are two ways that row calculus changed my life.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
One thing that has been the strangest kind of weird spiritual injunction. A lot of my technical life has been about these strange loops, these reflective loops. And what do they mean for computation? What do they mean for consciousness? All of the things that they normally people talk about them. But you could also contemplate strange loops in music. So you could contemplate the idea of encoding information that you want to pass to, for example, another musician in a musical phrase. and then in such a way that it's very conscious and deliberate, right? So you're spelling out to the musician, do this next, or or whatever, you're passing some information along, and that's intentional, and so you could therefore build music that talks about itself, right? And I have had the weirdest injunction that that's not for me to go explore.
Yeah.
It's so
That's,
weird, right?
like that's my play notes algorithm basically does that. Right? It's something that I have come up with when I was 17 or so, and I'm now using it to compose. It's a very simple algorithm. It's basically just creating like numbers that are just a pitch structure that's self-similar, like the intervals encoded, like everything is self-similar, and it's absolutely fascinating to work with that material because of that very, 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 I have to use the word here, maybe it's wrong, like logical or permutational structure.
Yeah.
The material can be used in almost any way. It has such a powerful organization in it that it's sort of impossible to destroy it. You can put it in canon with itself. You could split it in half and put those two on top of each other. You can do all sorts of manipulations of that material, and it will always be better than a random string of notes.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I need to just maybe give you some music that uses that process. It's really fascinating.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And like when you were talking about like language and music, for example, like one of my very first experiments as a 15-year-old was with my Atari ST, was to I had just read another Hofstadter book, and it was about isomorphism and like translating the ASCII numbers of letters to MIDI pitch, right? And I did that with like a Lewis Carroll poem, and it sounded horrible. I realized right away, oh, this doesn't make any sense. There's like the information may be isomorphic, but like we cannot pick it up. It doesn't translate because it's a different medium. And that's when I realized that the smallest unit for music is not one number. It's not that that one pitch, but it is an interval. You have to have the relation built into the main unit. The smallest unit has to have a relation, represent a coordination, actually, in a way, in it. And then if you build on top of that, you build with that, then things are working in the musical world.
Oh, interesting.
But if you just take numbers, they don't represent a relationship, then it doesn't work. Like yeah, anyway, but we can talk more about that off camera, but it's been so wonderful to finally get to talk to you about these things. And
likewise, thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad we could share.
Yes, and unless you have something else to say, let's call it a day.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. and so what do you usually write under your emails?
Love to all beings.
Yes. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Yeah. Thank you. Bye
for now. Ciao.